Welcome to the SportsPro Podcast.
Hi everyone, and welcome once again to the SportsPro Podcast. My name is Eoin Connolly. I'm the editor-at-large at SportsPro. Hope you're all very well. We've got two quite divergent conversations for you today. A little bit later on, we're going to be talking about digital security with Lu Bolden, who's the Chief Revenue Officer at Verimatrix. But before that, we have a new NFL season on the horizon. It's going to be kicking off, I think, either the evening of or certainly the evening after. Some of you will be listening to this podcast a little bit later on this week as we're speaking. A unique NFL season, but then you knew that already. Lots of other talking points to get into. And we're going to be getting into them with Peter Schwartz, who's the Senior Sports Valuations and Legal Reporter at Sportico. Hi, Peter.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on. Bit of a mouthful, that job title, but one thing that it has taken you into recently is a pretty comprehensive bit of work on the values of each of the NFL franchises. And that's something that we're going to be exploring a little bit later on in the podcast. But first of all, I mean, I don't know. Let's start with it. Given that we're going to be getting into detail later, let's start with a nice big nebulous question.
Okay.
What's the mood like in the US as the NFL season approaches?
Well, I would certainly say unlike the start of any other season, which probably wouldn't surprise you, but there's been very little buzz, no preseason, of course, this year, which is a dramatic change, and with hockey and basketball in their playoffs, baseball in the pennant stretch, it seems a little unusual. Everyone's calendars are kind of calibrated to football begins once basketball and hockey ends, and all of a sudden you have the Kentucky Derby in September, and everyone's thrown for a loop. So I think that football fans are certainly excited, but it's not status quo as usual, to be sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the odd things about this year is that in the sports world is that the NFL just about escaped the pandemic at both ends when it came to actually getting games to happen. Obviously, we have, what is it, about 26, I think, of the teams have confirmed that they're not going to have any fans in the venues, at least not in the month of September. But here we are, NFL finished up just in time, just as things started to get really hairy, kind of February, March, and it's coming back just as people have got used to the idea of sport being back on again.
Well, Owen, I wouldn't quite put it the same way. I don't think they've dodged a bullet quite yet. And by that I mean, yes, they're starting up with mostly empty stadiums, but come the fall, which is fast approaching, you have the flu season. You could have a resurgence of COVID. There's a lot of uncertainty. I would rather be in the shoes of some of the other leagues that are close to finishing their seasons, even under these unusual scenarios that they've been operating, than the NFL, which is just starting their season and walking into this great unknown. There's a legitimate chance that this season will be unable to be completed in the way that they've planned right now, or that it will be completed without a significant pause and retooling. And I'm not quite sure what the NFL's plan is. I'm not quite sure if the NFL has a plan, because they certainly haven't shared it as of yet, of what to do if this so-called second wave, which is really a misnomer, because a lot of places already are having their second wave, third wave, whatever you want to call it, emerges this fall. How does the NFL handle that? Will it be like basketball and hockey, or will it be like baseball, or will it be a third ground? It's too early to tell, but there's certainly a lot of uncertainties.
Now, each of those other leagues has taken a slightly different approach to containment and to best practice in hygiene and best practice in social distancing and so on. NBA and NHL, basically the whole leagues, or the whole league in the NBA's case and big chunks of it in the NHL's case, have all been in these larger bubbles to contain as many people as possible. MLB has decided that wasn't feasible given the number of games and teams they had involved still. So they've tried to protect each team, or each team has been responsible for its own safety under the kind of overview of the league. The NFL is kind of more in the latter camp, as I understand it. They've got 32 different sets of directives that are all derived from conversations they had back in the spring.
Yes, the NFL would certainly track most closely to Major League Baseball in that scenario, and I would say that Major League Baseball has had the most difficulty of the major North American sports leagues in restarting, or in their case, in starting their season from scratch. There is a method to their madness in that they have assessed the pandemic and figured that we're in a different place now than we are in March. We're in March, and as I mentioned, that doesn't mean we'll be in the same place in October that we are now in September. But they figured they could start in their 31 stadia for their 32 teams and try to make a go of it. As you pointed out, Eoin, it's very different from stadium to stadium about how many fans will be allowed in. In Indianapolis, it's a quarter of the fans. In a quarter of capacity. In other stadiums, it's 5,000 people. In most stadiums, it's zero. But I think that their approach is similar to that baseball approach, where everyone will play their home games and they'll fly to the uh, or drive, depending on where the game is scheduled, to their next venue and play that way. Is just a roll of the dice compared to the more certain way that basketball, and certainly hockey, which I think has been the model so far in this, has treated their response to the pandemic. But I understand why the NFL, which hadn't yet started their season, certainly would try to take the approach that they are.
The interesting thing that's going on with this NFL season, I mean, we've already touched upon the fact that the other major league seasons are not finished yet, and we're used to that in baseball's case, but not in the case of the NHL and NBA. So in that respect, there's going to be slightly more competition for attention for the NFL as it kicks off. But as the season wears on, there's almost no college football in at least not in this at this point of the year. There might be in the next semester of the college year in the spring. What do we think that's going to do for the dynamics of media attention and viewership and everything else? Or is the NFL just such a behemoth that it's probably going to roll everything else out of its way?
I would say the latter. When you look at NFL viewership numbers, I kind of chuckle from time to time when you see a report and it says NFL viewership down 1% or 2%. The NFL is garnering not pre-internet television ratings, but pre-cable TV television ratings. And by that, I mean, in the United States, the number of viewers in this fragmented universe that we have today is greater than it was when there were just three major broadcasters and not 1,000 channel universe, let alone Netflix and YouTube and everything else. So there is this built-in demand for football. I mentioned at the outset about how it's an unusual kickoff this year and less buzz certainly than usual. I really don't envision that being something that is sustained as the season goes on. I think that fans will get into their teams. I think they'll view it as something of a refuge. Watching sports, it is interesting that there was this craving and hankering to watch sports once they started up again. And ratings have been largely down across the board, but that's because everyone's lives have been so topsy-turvy. And certainly dedicating time to watch sports on TV is a different proposition than it once was. But that being said, I do think, just as you alluded to, the NFL is somewhat immune from a lot of this. So even if ratings are down, I think relative to everything else in the sports landscape, they'll still have their position as, I think, as you eloquently put it, as the bulldozer pushing everyone else out of the way.
What targets would the NFL have for this year then? From some of the conversations you've had around the league, obviously getting the season on and keeping the season going as safely as possible, trying to avert any kind of stoppages down the line as we get into the colder weather is going to be one thing. But what else is what are some of the other priorities? Are they going to be looking at, maybe some of the new media metrics that obviously they've been exploring deals with Amazon in the last few years, and digital distribution is a different challenge for them because, as you say, their linear ratings are so stratospheric. But they need to work out, I guess, where the value is for them in the next decade. How are they going to be looking at that this year?
I think you hit the nail on the head. The big issue, and if there wasn't a pandemic, it would really be the sole focus of the league, are these new broadcast rights deals that they're trying to negotiate for 2022. And the NFL is driven by its national revenues, not its local revenues like other sports. And by that I mean 60% of NFL revenues come from the national media deals, the national which is broadcasting and new media, national sponsorship deals, and also net royalties and revenues from their licensing and film division. So that's a huge piece of the pie for teams that I know you referenced earlier that we'll get into valuations, but for teams in the lower quartile, teams like the Bengals, which are ranked 32nd out of 32 in the league, national revenue accounts for 75%. I think in their case it was 73% or 74% of their total revenue. So this is a significant chunk. And there was talk pre-pandemic, and I really don't think that it can necessarily have changed that much in the interim, of the new broadcast deals being double the previous deals. Now, that might be a stretch, but certainly a significant increase is what the NFL was eyeing, and that's what they're going to try to pursue this year. In terms of the metrics of getting there, I think the television ratings themselves compared to past seasons is less significant than television ratings compared to the broader TV landscape, which is important. I mean, you had for the first time ever a couple of weeks ago a cable channel in the United States finished first for the month. It was released a couple of weeks ago, but this was for the month of June in television ratings, which never would have been thought of years ago. But that's because the over-the-air network broadcasters have such smaller shares of the audience than they used to. So what the NFL really does is bring into sharp relief the gap between the percentage of people that watch their games and the percentage of people that watch other programming. That's really a more useful metric for the TV networks themselves than year-over-year ratings.
The major TV deals begin to lapse at the end of next season, so we're really approaching now a formal negotiation phase for the NFL with some of its broadcast partners for some of its longer term deals. What kind of stories are we going to see coming out over the course of this season? Do you think will there be a lid on it until the new year, or will we start to see some movement there?
I think that you'll start to see some movement. There's already been some buzz around Walt Disney Company, and this is one of the more interesting storylines in television media, sports media, is that ESPN, which is owned 80% by Disney, pays astronomically for the rights for Monday Night Football. And they have historically received the worst slate of games. Now, part of that is scheduling and projecting who's going to be competitive in a given year, but part of that is the Sunday night package, which NBC has had for the last nearly 2 decades now, it has the ability to flex games and move them from the afternoon to the evening. So, long story short, when ESPN used to broadcast the Sunday night games, they were not in the position that NBC is in now. So ESPN is looking, or Walt Disney Company is looking to add more games, add better games, and move part of them to ABC, which is the over-the-air broadcast network that company owns entirely. So it creates an interesting, almost three-card Monty. And by that, I mean the NFL has been wildly successful in keeping out one broadcaster in all of their media rights deals, which creates a demand for the other broadcasters to pay more. So right now, ABC is the broadcaster that's out. They simulcast a playoff game and the Pro Bowl game with ESPN, but they do not have a traditional rights deal. Disney wants to change that. And there's been some reporting on that so far, and a lot of reporting about ESPN's discontent with their games and how if they are going to pay more, let alone continue to pay so much more than everyone else, they want essentially a better deal. I'm not sure if the NFL can keep a lid on that. I like how you put that, until the end of the year, because there's been so much movement on that front. It'll be really interesting to see how that plays out. Although I would say that the league has been pretty good. The Thursday night negotiations with Fox, which took the rights from NBC and CBS, which had shared them last year, is a good indicator of how the NFL is very orderly about the way that they do this. So it'll be interesting to watch for sure.
Now, one of the conversations that we have periodically here about the Premier League and its ambitions, perhaps not for the next right cycle. Obviously, right cycles here are notably shorter. But, the conversation is, at what point does the Premier League create a branded product, or would they ever think of creating a branded media product that's, either OTT, or that they retain a huge amount of control over distribution? Do they go in with a partner for that? Do they, et cetera, et cetera? Is that something that would ever be in the NFL's future, given how much success they've had with this very broad strategy, and cycling through the networks for the Super Bowl and so on? Is it something that would be in the NFL's future to say to Amazon or Disney, who would be perhaps the two likeliest to have the kind of heft and expertise to be able to pull it off? We want to create a big media product that we control, that we own, that's ready for a kind of direct consumer future? Or is that just not really in their playbook?
The short answer is no, but the longer answer is it depends to what extent they would follow that strategy. And by that I mean they could certainly do that, and you've seen the league increase their partnership with Amazon, for example, in recent years, and try to reach the audience through new ways. But it would be limited to the extent of it would not be a scenario where they would do that in lieu of the traditional deals. And there's a whole other element that besides the fabulous success they've had with the broadcast deals over the years and the revenues that are derived in the whole "if it ain't broke, don't fix it" mantra. There's a practical reason why they cannot really change from their current format, and that is they've issued a lot of bonds that are guaranteed based on future revenues from broadcast agreements. Fitch Ratings just last week came out with their new ratings of NFL bonds, all of which I believe there are 18 now are rated A or A plus, which are very good ratings. But a lot of these are based on the certainty of guaranteed revenues from future national partnerships, predominantly television rights. Certainly not all the bonds, but that is a part of some of them. And these bonds are used to finance stadium operations, construction / renovation, team different programs that the teams have opted into. So the current model, in addition to working so much better than for any other league, based on the way football works with their limited quantity of games and with the importance of each game and how television friendly it is. I think that it wouldn't be in their interest to have a wholesale change, but also practically they can't really do it. I do think at the same time, though, they should continue to explore newer ways of getting their product to newer and younger audiences. Certainly will only benefit them in the long run.
Now, I want to get on to these valuations in a few moments, but there's an elephant in the room when it comes to this NFL season. There is a presidential election about 8 weeks into the season. There's been obviously an enormous amount of engagement with social issues from other leagues over the course of the summer, and the NFL has changed its policies around athlete expressions and around trying to have a more constructive, shall we say, attitude towards issues of racial politics. How is that going to play out? Is this going to be an unknown for the NFL, given how it was almost the kind of atmosphere of antagonism a few years ago when you started to see protests from Colin Kaepernick and other players?
Well, that's a really interesting question, and certainly the developments of the last month have really brought that into focus. Where Roger Goodell, the commissioner of the NFL, expressed regret about how he's handled this situation, and really implicitly was, I would say most should say he should have said explicitly that he should have been more frank from the beginning in understanding Kaepernick's point of view. This is a far cry from last year, I think it was, when the commissioner had arranged the workout for Kaepernick that eventually fell apart, and the two parties were really not on speaking terms. Now the NFL has kind of come hat in hand in a way, and admitted that they were wrong in their current thinking of it. And I think that that'll go a long way in terms of the way that players react to the league's previously strong reactions in the other way. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out this season. Certainly, with the microscope of politics focused on this. Although I would say that the players and the league, really the owners, seem closer together on it than they have been in recent years.
Is there a sense that the NFL is going to try and walk a line a little bit more on these kind of issues, or try and find its own path through them, at least, given the scale of it for one thing, but its history and the difficulties that it's caused? I mean, is it brave enough to take a side in a culture war, basically, which is what it ended up being dragged into back in 2017, towards the end of that Kaepernick protest season? One of the things that, and I'm slightly drifting off the premise of the question, but one of the things that's quite interesting, your boss, Scott Soshnick, pointed this out on Twitter the other day, or highlighted it, which is this pledge that the NFL has made that it's going to close its offices on the 3rd of November for the general election and give everybody an opportunity to vote in that presidential election. Is it going to be that kind of platform that it creates, where it's giving people an opportunity to engage rather than putting a gloss on issues in one way or another?
Well, I wish that I was in a position where I knew the answer to that question, but I will tell you that that's certainly the hope. History would say that it's probably not going to be as clear cut as that, given all the dynamics that you've mentioned, and the way that this has been used as a battle in the culture war, exactly as you said. However, I'm certainly hopeful that there's some type of understanding now, and able to move forward in a constructive way that may not have been the case in recent years.
Join the conversation with the SportsPro community. Follow us on Twitter @SportsPro. Find us on Instagram @sportspro.media. And connect to SportsPro Media on LinkedIn, where you can also become a part of our specialist OTT community. SportsPro, connecting and inspiring the business world of sport.
Let's take a look now at some of these team valuations that you've done over at Sportico. No surprises in that the Dallas Cowboys are estimated to be the most valuable team in the NFL. Obviously, they've decades of brand equity and popularity, and this enormous stadium as well, the AT&T Stadium, that's still kind of a global standard bearer. What were some of the other interesting stories that came out of some of the analysis you did, though?
I think the most interesting teams, which are kind of on total opposite ends of the spectrum, are the Los Angeles Rams, first and foremost, and the Jacksonville Jaguars. But to focus on the Rams first, you mentioned Dallas and their stadium as a global standard bearer. The Cowboys we had first, as you mentioned, $6.43 billion is the fair market value of the team, just an astronomical amount compared to transactions from years ago. The Patriots were second at a hair under $5 billion, $4.97 billion, and the Rams were third. And what makes the Rams very interesting is that our valuations included not only the team, even though the team itself is the most significant part, but to be realistic with the way that these franchise transactions occur in 2020, we're looking not only at the team, but team-related businesses and real estate entities held by owners that they use the team, they leverage the team to get into other businesses. And the Rams are doing that better than anybody. So when I mention that your reference to the stadium, I think what the Rams have built in California and what is going to open on the 13th of September, actually, is really going to be a game changer in terms of the way that sports stadia and infrastructure is merged with surrounding real estate and team-related interests and entities to create an environment well beyond the playing field, a mixed retail, mixed-use commercial venture that is, its size and scope is really unlike anything that we've seen. So right now we have the Rams third at $4.1 billion, but I think that their growth is really noteworthy, especially when considering they're third in value right now, and in revenue, they're 26th of the 32 teams. So once they really get this stadium firing on all cylinders, I really think the sky is the limit. The other team I mentioned, the Jaguars, are interesting for a couple of reasons. So if you look on Sportico, we have this data visualization where you can compare all the teams and really look at all of the factors that go into the value for every team. If you were to select the Jaguars, as I'm doing now, they're 25th. They're at $2.39 billion. However, they're doing some very interesting things, one of which is, as you know very well, are the games in London. They had planned 2 games there this year, up from 1, which is what they had done previously, really trying to build their brand, of course, before COVID canceled that. But that's helped. It's helped on the margins. They still, because of what I mentioned earlier, 60% of all revenues in the case of the Jaguars, it's 65% comes from national sources. The other 35% got a little bit of a boost from their international efforts. Maybe not a huge boost, but it helps. It helps with their branding and their recognizability. But the other thing is they've taken a page out of the book of the Rams and the Patriots, the Washington team, and the Packers in terms of leveraging the team in the way I described for surrounding real estate interests. So they have a joint venture next to the stadium in Jacksonville that has yet to be approved. But if it is, as most, if not everybody, expects it to be, is really going to be kind of like a maybe not like a Patriot Place, which any of your listeners who have visited New England knows that this 1,000 acres, literally 1,000 acres around Gillette Stadium is kind of a Patriots theme park, if you will, this retail mecca. It might not be that, but it's going to be something unique and something value added. So I'd watch the Jaguars in the years to come as well.
I mean, just looking at your list or your dial as it's actually presented on the site, of the top 6 teams, you've got the Cowboys, the Patriots are second, who've obviously won a lot of Super Bowls in the last 20 years. And then you have LA, the 2 New York teams, and San Francisco, who are all in big, relatively new, high-end stadiums. I mean, is the correlation that direct between real estate, for want of a better term, and the value of an NFL franchise at the moment and the opportunity for growth?
Well, when you say real estate, there's really two factors you look at. You look at the stadium itself and the revenue that's derived from the stadium, and also the ownership of the stadium. Only 4 teams, counting the Rams now, with starting next week, will actually own their stadium. The rest have operational control of their stadium, but municipal authorities actually own it. And there is an important distinction in terms of valuing the team and what can be bought and sold from that. But then when we talk about real estate, there's also these enterprises like what I mentioned the Jaguars are trying to do and the Patriots do already, which are real estate projects that team ownership commits themselves to around the stadium, which creates commercial opportunities and can derive lots of revenue from that as well. The Cowboys are a great example because not at their stadium, but at their practice facility, they've created an entire complex called the Star, where they sell sponsorships and they sell merchandise just like it's kind of a second venue. So that's a huge driver for these teams. But putting that aside and just looking at the dynamic of owning a stadium versus controlling a stadium as the leaseholder, there's also a third ground, which is where the Giants and Jets are. So you mentioned the Giants are 4th, the Jets are 5th overall in revenue, in value rather. The Giants we have at $4 billion and the Jets at $3.7 billion. Their market is the same. The value that we ascribe to them as the leaseholders of the stadium are the same. Really, the difference between those teams comes down primarily to sponsorship revenue, and then you extrapolate that out into value. But when it comes to the stadium, they've created a very interesting dynamic. So the Giants and the Jets are co-venturers in a management company that controls MetLife Stadium. So they control all the events. You know, Bruce Springsteen sings there. If there's a monster truck rally, they get the revenue and they split that evenly. But they don't actually own the stadium, so they can't sell it in the same way that the Miami Dolphins could, for example. So all of this plays a role, but I would say in football, as opposed to some other sports, there are fewer teams that actually own the stadium, and as a result, there are fewer teams that can claim tax depreciations on the stadium, which has probably a more significant impact than one might think in terms of how the owners look at these entities.
And just to wrap up, I mean, what are some of the other opportunities for growth that NFL franchises have, given how much of their revenue and how much of the baseline is pooled at a league level?
Well, so national revenue is certainly gonna grow based on the new media deals that we talked about, and based on the trajectory that it's been on for years, if not decades. What's interesting is how the different teams approach it locally. So by that I mean, right now there are only 2 teams that generate more money from their stadium and from sponsorships at the local level and ticket sales, of course, than they do from national revenue: the Cowboys and the Patriots. The Giants, interestingly, generated an estimated 296 million from both sources. So they're third, and then everyone else in the league, from the Jets all the way down to the Bengals, not to pick on the Bengals, generated more money nationally than locally. So when you ask about drivers of growth, the more teams can generate at the local level through their stadium, the more that they can kind of close the gap between this widening range of values between the top and the bottom. And there are ways of doing that. There are a number of teams that do not sell naming rights to their stadium, for example. There are a lot of kind of what I would say, and I don't mean this pejoratively, it's just a way to describe them, of old school football business owners, where the business of a football team is just that. It's a football team, and it's not this kind of multifaceted entity that we talked about with the Cowboys, for example. So there are ways of increasing local revenues. Maybe it might not keep pace with the projected increase of national revenues, but that will help some of the teams that are towards the bottom of the ranking close the gap, and at the same time that makes them more appealing to prospective owners. If someone wants to and is in the position where they can buy the team, the NFL has very stringent requirements of potential owners. But if they are, and they can increase revenues the way David Tepper has since buying the Panthers 2 years ago, good on them. I think that that's a very appealing investment right now.
Yeah, where are new investors going to come from, given the scale that we're talking about now?
Well, that's the big question, because we talk about in the story that accompanies the valuations. We ask with a nod and a wink to the financial crisis from years ago, when they asked whether banks were too big to fail. We ask whether the Cowboys are too big to sell, because the NFL has requirements of in terms of debt and equity. So equity, meaning the principal owner has to put up at least 30%, which makes it very difficult for minority owners or limited partners, as they're called in the sports context, to be invest billions of dollars and have no say in the team. So really, what that creates is a situation where you have to have someone with an enormous net worth, because in the NFL, corporate and private equity ownership is not allowed, even for minority stakes, to buy a team. And at the same time, there's debt requirements where a team can only borrow. I say only, but think of the values we're talking about. Can only borrow $500 million right now to finance their operations, including for acquisition purposes. So the league is right now discussing changing that and creating a $1 billion acquisition debt threshold, but that's not in place yet. So to answer your question, this creates a very, very limited universe of potential deep-pocketed owners who can afford the teams, certainly at the top. When you start getting into the teams at the bottom, there's a wider net that can be cast of billionaires who can buy these teams. But the problem then becomes one of geography, because the NFL is the only league where they've never had, only league in North America, where they've never had a non-US resident own a team. So by limiting their pool, even if it's not a written rule, but by the way the league has customarily selected its owners, maybe that's to do with interest and how American football is less of a global sport than some of the others. But by limiting the pool of billionaire prospective owners to the United States, you're really closing the ranks on who might get in.
Okay, well, lots to look out for, not just in this NFL season, but in the next several to come, I think, and on a lot of those topics. Peter, thanks very much. You've been very generous with your time. If people are interested in some more NFL content related to the new season, Steve Ziff, the Chief Marketing Officer at the Los Angeles Chargers, who'll be sharing SoFi Stadium with the LA Rams, he's been talking to Sam Karp. That feature is on our site now. There should also be very shortly a full commercial preview of the season on sportspromedia.com. We're going to be talking after the break to Lu Bolden, the Chief Revenue Officer at Verimatrix, about digital security. But for now, I will say thank you very much to Peter Schwartz.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll be speaking to you again just after this.
Help us spread the word about the SportsPro Podcast. Subscribe, like and share our content on social. Join the conversation on Twitter with the hashtag SportsProPod. And if you're enjoying our work, why not leave us a rating and a nice review on your podcast platform of choice? And if you want to get in touch, you can send us an email, podcast@sportspromedia.com. The SportsPro Podcast. We're listening too.
Welcome back to the SportsPro Podcast. Thanks again to Peter Schwartz for his time in part one. We're going to be moving on to the topic of digital security in just a moment. But before that, a very quick, very short final plug for SportsPro Live, which is happening online next week on the 16th and 17th of September. It's really come together very nicely, even if we do say so ourselves. If you still need to know more about why to register, or you want to find out how to register, go to sportsprolive.com. All the information you need, the agenda, details of our virtual networking, everything is there. So do go and check that out. If you're a regular listener to the podcast, you can look forward to some reaction from the event next week. We're really looking forward to it. That address, one last time, is sportsprolive.com. Hope to see you there, so to speak. Okay, on we go with today's podcast. You obviously don't need me to tell you, or I certainly hope you don't anyway, that more and more of our consumption and contact is happening digitally, especially this year. That creates all kinds of possibilities, but it also gives everyone across the sports industry more to think about when it comes to security, not least with so many more rights holders, brands, and broadcasters managing direct relationships with their fans. So amidst all of that, how do you protect content? How do you protect data? How do you keep your transactions secure? And how do you do all of that across a range of platforms in a way that doesn't obstruct or complicate your interactions with fans? Lu Bolden, who, by the way, is going to be appearing at SportsPro Live, is the Chief Revenue Officer at Verimatrix, which provides solutions in a whole range of contexts, from mobile apps to video players and the Internet of Things. I spoke to him recently about all of those issues, as well as the implications for rights holders and their responsibilities in the shift to D2C, and some other ways in which the space is going to evolve. Plenty of interesting ground to cover. I will leave you with that interview and speak to you again next time.
This is the SportsPro Podcast.
Lu Bolden, Chief Revenue Officer at Verimatrix. Welcome to the SportsPro Podcast.
Thanks, Owen. Appreciate you having me here.
Appreciate you coming on, Lu. First of all, why don't you just open up by giving us an introduction to Verimatrix and the work it is that you do?
Certainly. So Verimatrix is a security company that focuses on safeguarding an unprotected world. You probably might not have heard of Verimatrix unless you're in the media and entertainment space, but we have products and services that are all around you and you're using that you might not even know today. From video entertainment and streaming media security solutions to security cameras, entertainment systems in cars and keyless entry, and even working with payment systems for some of the largest banks and credit card companies in the world. We focus on providing conditional access and entitlement solutions for pay TV operators, broadcasters, and content owners globally. We have 1,100 customers in 120 countries around the world, and we're focused on many markets from media and entertainment, financial markets, IoT, automotive, even gaming, esports, and healthcare. It's all software-based security solutions that have a client side and a server side component, both offered on premise and in the cloud.
Quite a broad spectrum of stuff that you're doing. I mean, what's the state of the digital security sector at the moment? What can you tell us about that? Because as you say, this is infrastructure that people come into contact with all the time.
Well, it's rapidly changing today, and I think that's being accelerated by the global pandemic as more and more companies are focusing on a shift to digital communications, uh, doing more and more through applications and remotely. We have to shift the way that we also secure that information, that entertainment, those applications, because the consumption and the way that things are being consumed is changing dramatically. I'll just use one example from one of our key markets, which is the media and entertainment space. Is previously when you wanted to think about the sports rights holders, right? Those folks that control that content, they really had in many cases a a segregated relationship with the consumption at the consumer side when it came to digital. They had agreements with their distributors, whether it's a TV channel or a pay TV operator, and that consumption was done through those third parties, and they had the interaction with that end consumer. Today, because say events and venues are closed, it's much more challenging, and many rights holders are considering how they can provide their products and services, right? The entertainment, the sports events directly to that consumer. So that's a big shift for those rights holders, and a shift for the companies that were distributing that content for them previously. And of course, they don't want to endanger those relationships. They want to give the best experience possible to the end users, the consumers, the ones that are enjoying the sports. But these type of things are shifting across all of the markets.
Just to bring the focus back onto Verimatrix for a sec, who are some of the people that you're working with in sport? What are some of the areas you're working in?
Yeah, so one of the key areas we work in is really securing the content from the source. So from the broadcast center of the sport to, say, for example, their distributors. So ensuring that that content, as it's being sent to those distributors, is secured, is watermarked in a way so that in the event that there's a leak, we can track it back to the source. We try to make it more secure in the transmission by encrypting and entitling the individual reception devices, but also looking at marking those devices so that you can really see where that content comes from. So we can find out who the bad actors are and turn them off.
You were talking just a moment ago about the specific context of COVID and some of the changes that's brought about, some of the challenges that's created as a result. But just looking outside that and outside the last few months, how have the broader changes in sports consumption created, new challenges in digital security?
Well, one of the things that's happening more broadly is that there's a direct relationship with the consumer and and the sport itself. So what's happened oftentimes has happened is there may be multiple applications and subscription services provided by the league directly to that end consumer, and that is a real shift for those leagues to have that direct relationship. And while technology, right, the ability to launch, we'll call it a channel, or the ability to stream that content and create an application for the end consumer to utilize that and see it, securing that content and securing the credentials, the payment systems for the end consumer is a challenge, and oftentimes that's overlooked in the rush to get the services out and provide the consumer what it is they're looking for, is to be able to watch sport on any device, anytime, anywhere, around the world. And so what we can bring, and where we try to work with the next generation of consumption and distribution, is to add that layer of security end to end, from the point where the content is produced, the sport is produced, all the way through that value chain to the end consumer. So we're not only protecting the content itself, we're protecting the application for the end consumer from piracy, theft, repackaging, so that there are less challenges and less risk, not only for the end consumer, but for the brand.
And obviously that places a different set of responsibilities. That relationship places new responsibilities on rights holders when it comes to the protection of content more generally. That's something that they would have typically, when you sell rights and you give somebody else the opportunity to exploit those on their own platform, that's something that they are basically outsourcing. So how does that affect what a rights holder is doing? How does that affect the things that they need to be cognizant of when they're distributing that content?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that really is a big shift, right, for rights holders and distributors. It kind of a little bit was a fire and forget previously. Here's the rights, here are the requirements for protection on the distributors, and now they have to shift and go, ooh, how do I do that myself? Who is going to be responsible for those components? And and I think it's particularly challenging when the focus of the rights holders is creating great entertainment and great value, in the for the rights for the sporting events that are there. So the major challenges that they'll will run up against there is just finding the right platforms and partners to help them through this transition while still maintaining the relationship with those distributors. And it can be done today. One of the benefits is of the technology and moving to streaming technology for the direct to consumer from the rights holder and even through the distributors, is that there are security platforms available where you're not creating this duplication of effort, where you're not necessarily sending the content that you're using for direct to consumer. When you create that as a rights holder, can also be used by your distributors. So you can make things more efficient all the way throughout the distribution chain, while still securing your content and ensuring that it's going to the appropriate people that need to be that have signed up and are subscribing to the service, whether it's directly with a rights holder or through a distributor. And having the appropriate security is not just encryption, right?
Mm.
It's not just marking. It also has to do with authentication and authorization and ensuring that only the right people get to view the content. So that could come into how many folks are utilizing a single username and password. And how do you authenticate that and make sure that multiple people don't have the username and password and are signed in? There are technologies that are available that can use facial recognition and thumbprint recognition, even on a big screen.
The other aspect to that, of course, is that it's a relationship, and it's often a very personalized relationship. When people are using a digital product specifically, they expect a degree of personalization. They expect seamlessness. They basically want the technology to disappear. So when you're when you're thinking about introducing layers of security, how do you do that in such a way that people are not conscious of it, I guess, in when they're interacting with the product and when they're paying for things and so forth?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Making security, making the application itself and the user experience easy is incredibly important. And the best securities, you don't even see that they're there. And it is a major focus for us here at Verimatrix. And so one of the ways to do that, and that we can do that and we help, is to make that part of your standard login process. Remembering usernames and passwords are challenging. But if you can tie that into a biometric or to a facial recognition, for that particular end user, to one, make the login process easier, especially when you're shifting devices. And I think that's something that I want to point out, that one of the things that's interesting is, yes, when you have your phone by itself and you're there, your username and password is remembered. But when you shift to another device, let's say you're at a friend's house and you want to watch what you've subscribed to there with a friend, remembering that username and password on that smart TV is a real challenge.
Hmm.
If you can then make, through with added security, make that a very easy process by which you're able to authenticate that, yes, it's Eoin there with his phone who is logging into that new smart TV without having to uh, for Eoin to go, what is my username and password, go through a reset process, but authenticate that Owen's there with his phone. It brings up a QR code on the screen, for example, and the phone then says, oh, yes, I biometrically validated that that's Eoin versus a username and password, which could be out there in the wild somewhere. Now you're able to give that rights holder or distributor that added comfort that this is a paid for service, while at the same time making that user experience and the ability to get to that content easy for the consumer.
Obviously bound up in that as well is the security at the user end. You're supplying personal information, you're supplying financial information. How much is that a part of the same process, and how much is that a separate exercise?
Yeah, it really is a separate exercise. There's a couple of components. Is one, the authentication authorization piece that's there itself for the content and saying this is that end user. All of that communication is secured to the back end. But separately, even if that's already taken care of, there are vulnerabilities within applications themselves, and the app itself needs to be protected. And while I'll say that Apple and Android do a good job protecting the operating system within their devices, the application itself can be an attack vector for a number of things, for personal information that may be there, for repackaging of that application so that it looks, feels, smells the same as a valid application from the provider or whoever created that app, but it can be manipulated. So protecting that app itself and securing the application itself protects not only the end user, but also protects the company from malicious attacks and taking revenue and the experience away from that end user themselves. So it while they're connected, they can be separated, and it not only it doesn't have to apply to, for example, just the video experience app. If you think about rights holders, they also have many e-commerce uh, and uh, and brand merchandising that they're providing, to their fans, and that's another application or path to connect with the rights holder and the brand, and that experience needs to be protected as well through the application, because that's our primary interface today with those brands and those sports franchises.
And the other element of any kind of digital service, and something that perhaps is newer again to the sports industry, especially on the rights holder side, where so much of that work had been kind of left to partners, either to their sponsors or their broadcast partners to kind of deal with. But is the manipulation of data, the processing of data on the strategic side to learn more about your fan groups, to learn more about how to individualize experiences and all that type of stuff. And again, I suppose that's another point at which you're thinking about the security of an individual's data, and it's something that you don't want to escape into the wild.
Yeah, that's absolutely incredibly important today with the proliferation of applications and those consumption methods. And so securing that data channel and being able to make the modifications quickly uh, that need to happen, and also ensuring when you ensure the security, you also secure the veracity of the data, right? You want to make sure that the data coming back is the real data that has to do with that consumer, and stored in a way that's protected so that there is less risk to the consumer and the brand, because the last thing you want to have happen is for your brand to be the reason that the consumer data got out into the wild and at risk. You can look at some of the attacks on Garmin. You can look at what's happened with attacks on the WhatsApp applications, where a lot of the personal information for the users got out into the wild, and that's a risk not only for the individual but for the brand itself. So securing those data channels and ensuring that the data is stored in a secure manner is also critical to the trust that the end consumers put in the brands and the folks that are providing the great content.
And again, from a perception perspective, it is all one job. Like, you're trying to keep the platform as secure as possible. But from a technical perspective, how different an activity is that, securing that kind of data?
Yeah, they're very different, very, very different efforts in terms of securing the data itself, having it in a usable, secure format, whether that's in a public cloud or a private cloud, and securing the content and the application. So there really are three discrete um, activities associated with it, even though the data path, right, from the application or from the consumption devices back to the core systems is over IP in a digital manner. So the consumption and collection of that data is done differently via different channels. So it's very complex, and of course, as we talked about at the beginning of the discussion, is that for the rights holders, it's a big shift from just producing and providing the great content to doing that directly to an end consumer. And that's where it's important to work with folks on a consultative basis with all of the partners in the technical ecosystem to help make those next steps, because the technology, the products and services are out there and have been for some time, with their distributors. And so looking at how we can do this with a best of breed approach, because this digital transition has been underway for some time, and now it's accelerating due to not only the availability of technology in the cloud to make these types of things, types of moves quickly, but also because of the current pandemic.
Let's bring the conversation back round to Verimatrix specifically before we finish. I mean, what do you see as the strategy for you guys, the future growth strategy for Verimatrix? What are some of your targets at the moment?
Yeah, I think one of our key targets, I would take the media and entertainment space to start with, right, in sports, is to look at how we can reduce the duplication of effort while still maintaining that's happening in the current digital content and sports and entertainment industry, while still maintaining the security. And I'll take through an example here. We have a rights holder that's producing this great content, and going direct to consumer with that same content for consumption on a mobile device. We also have a channel distributor that is taking the rights holders content and putting it into their linear channel broadcast. They are also then encoding and processing and securing that content themselves, for consumption on a mobile device or with a streaming format. That linear channel, we could call it BBC, we could call it Rai, anything like that at ESPN. That channel then provides that content to a distributor like a British Telecom or a Comcast, who then also takes that same content and encodes it and encrypts it and puts it into a format for consumption on a mobile device. Uh, so now we've got four different layers doing that, and it's repeated for that particular piece of sports content times all of the different distribution and consumption outlets that are out there. It's not very efficient, right? But the consumption manner is the same. So the concern there is being able to secure that content in that distribution, and authenticate it for the end users around the world. So where I see us from a strategic standpoint and where we're looking to go and provide value, not only to the rights holders, but every step along that chain, because the consumption of the content is the same, is to process and encrypt and secure once, and have a security layer, an authentication layer that not only authenticates for the direct to consumer when it's consumed on the rights holders app, but also without having to reprocess the content when it's consumed on the channels app, when it's consumed on the pay TV operators app or the satellite distributors app. And that reduces the complexity, it increases the time to revenue, and it actually provides added security for that content all along the chain, because it's not having to be reprocessed, and there's we remove the air gaps within within the content processing. It also ensures that for every step along the chain, that the data can come back because there's no loss of continuity, so that you can get accurate usage and consumption information, which is very important to the entire value chain as it pertains to advertising, which is generally how the revenue is generated around live sport, and for many of the distributors that are there. So that's where I see us going, and doing that and helping to optimize the revenue, and secure the revenue for everyone along the distribution chain.
Do you have a client profile in mind? Do you have an idea of some of the spaces in the industry that are going to open up to you, or is this something where you feel the shift is so universal that there could be opportunities for you everywhere?
Yeah, I think it's happening. It's happening now, and this because trying to figure out how to do this efficiently without damaging the previous relationships that they had, and it's the technology that we brought to bear to support this is now ready and available. And so what it takes is a coordinated effort and communications within the rights holder community to say, hey, I can help this be a better, more secure, more seamless, faster service, not only for me, but for my distributors. And so I think this is because of the adoption of digital universally, that this is the direction that the market is going. It's just taken some time, and the pandemic has accelerated.
Okay. It's interesting stuff. Interesting to see where it'll all go. But for now, thanks very much for your time, Lu.
Thank you, Owen. I really enjoyed it, and have a great day.
You too.
The SportsPro podcast is published by SportsPro Media. The producer is Ed Dixon.